Hello, in this tutorial we'll be creating the first elements for the game. We're going to start with the user interface, getting some of the basics and the core systems in. Before we get started, I'm going to clean up my scene a little bit. I'm going to delete the point light, the light switch. So I'm just going to select both of those and hit delete. We don't need rocket art right now, so I'm going to delete that as well. I'm going to leave that directional light just in case we need it, and I'm going to leave the main camera and the Playmaker GUI. Both of those are pretty critical to your game. So to make a UI, the first step is to right click here in the hierarchy, find where it says UI, and we want an object called canvas. Canvas is the sort of overall parent. It's the framework of the UI. All of your UI will live in here, and it's pretty stinking huge. So we're going to just back up a little bit. You can do that just, again, by your mouse wheel works. You can scroll out, shift click, or holding a shift key down lets you move faster. And also, while you're working in UI, it is sometimes really helpful to press this 2D key. You'll be able to see things a lot easier. And I've just scrolled way out. There we go. And then you can toggle it back anytime to go into 3D mode right there, right? So I'm going to be in 2D mode. It'll make things a lot easier. Okay, so the first thing we're going to add is the fuel meter. Let me tell you a little bit about the game first. The way the game works is that you're controlling a rocket and you're trying to land it safely on a landing pad. You'll be navigating through asteroids and you will have limited fuel. So the idea is to land the rocket very gently onto the landing pad before running out of fuel. If you run out of fuel, or if you land on the pad too quickly, or if you're going too fast, you'll explode. So nice, graceful landings, and fuel totally matters, right? So let's make a fuel meter. Now, for us, just to keep things simple, we're going to use text. What we do first is we're going to right-click on the canvas object, and we're going to go to UI again, and we're going to do text. So for us, let me show you something else while we're at it. There is a way to, you can customize your Unity window however you like. This is how I like mine, but you can drag each of these panels around and kind of make up your own configuration. I didn't like how the inspector tab was hiding behind the Playmaker window, so I moved that. Alright, so back to the UI. So we've got this text object. Let's call this one fuel. So over here in the text box, let's call this fuel, and let's change this here to say fuel remaining. This is the actual words that we'll see on screen, and that's a little hard to see the black on the black background, so I'm going to make those white. I'm going to scroll back a little bit, and then I'm going to use the move tool. I'm going to move it up here, kind of center screen. I want to call your attention to the anchors. So in Unity, in the UI, you can actually anchor it to a certain portion of the screen. This is nice. If the player resizes the screen, it'll stay in that general location. So right now we're middle. We want middle top. That's where our object is. So make sure you anchor that there. And I think that should be a bit bigger. So see where it says font size? We're going to increase that a bit. And notice it just disappeared. That's because the holder for it is too small, the UI frame for that. And the UI, we're going to look at this particular object right here. This is called the rect tool. Now, see how it brings up these little dots? I'm going to drag that to be a bit bigger. Okay. Now I'm going to move that over a little bit because I'd also like to create another object, another text object parented to fuel. I'm going to right click, I'm going to do a UI, and I'm going to do text. And what this is going to be, the actual number of fuel left. This is going to be the number that changes. Fuel remaining will be static. This number will be variable, right? So let's see, how big do we make that? We made that 25. Let's make U 25. And just for a placeholder, let's put 100 in there. Let's make you white as well, make you easier to see. Now that's terrible placement. Let's move it over, kind of get into place there. Okay, I want to rename this text object to fuel meter. And this is where all of our scripts for this object is going to live. So we're not going to have anything on this guy. We're going to have it all on this secondary object. So let's get started on making this work. So we need to add an FSM to it. So you right click here, add FSM. And we're going to call this first state init, short for initialization. And then we're going to make another one. And this is going to be called update UI. Oops, helps if you spell it right. So real quickly about the design of this, fuel remaining, this number, the number portion, only needs to change when the player is pressing their thrust keys. Otherwise, it just doesn't need to do anything. It can just hang out. So we don't want to be updating this number every single frame. We only want to update it when it's necessary to do so. So we're going to use a what's called a global transition to basically signal to this script. From the player object, we'll signal to this particular state to update the UI only when it's necessary. It'll make a whole lot more sense when we get to the player object. So take my word for it for now. So to make an event, remember we go here to the Events tab, and we're going to call this one Update UI. So type that in, Update UI. All right. And then previously, we would have added our transition on the lower portion to connect it from one state to the other, but this is a global one. And we want global because we want to be able to just send it to this script and have it come here without question. So right-click on Update UI and do Add Global Transition. Not this one, right? This is one we used before. It's this one. And we want Update UI. So see how it looks similar to the start state? So, you know, if we had a dozen other scripts, you know, I can add just to, don't add these. These are just me showing you an example. If this script was normally working like this, right, and it was just fluctuating back and forth between these two different states, and then another script sends a message to this script and says, update UI, it would interrupt and immediately break and come right here to do that. And that's super valuable when you have a script that you want to have it kill every other action. For example, a death state. You could have a controller that you're using to control your player's movements, and then have a state called death UI, or dead, and it would interrupt all those things that are happening. And now nothing will happen except what's in this box. Notice, see, there's no transitions out, right? So that's what we're doing here, is we're going to use this particular object to update the UI. All right, so let's get started with the sort of init state. So we need a variable. We need a variable called fuel. So we're going to start with that. Let's go over here to Playmaker, and we're looking for a window called Global Variables. See that guy right there? Global Variables. All right. So we need a float, and we're going to call that float fuel. A float, if you don't know, is a type of number that has decimal points, and we want to be very, very precise, so we're going to use a float. Okay, we've created that. So let's close that window down now. Globals are useful when multiple objects in the scene need to refer to that, or even multiple scenes need to refer to that. For us, multiple objects are going to refer to this fuel object, so we're just going to use a global, so it'll be much easier to find that variable. All right, now we've made our variable, let's do something with it. In this particular UI, all we really care about is displaying the number. So what we're going to look for is we need to turn that number into a string. A string is a text variable. So we're going to add an action called convert string, convert float. convert float to string. Okay. So yeah, what this action does is exactly how it sounds. It's going to take a float object and turn it into a string object. So do globals, right? Find fuel. And then we want to turn that into a variable we can use, a string version of that fuel. There isn't a variable. We don't need to make a global variable for this one because this object, the UI, is the only one that's going to use it. So see where it says new variable? Click on that one. And then let's type in something like fuel, and then I like to do this, fuel str, short for string, and I like to do it in all caps, that way I don't accidentally mistake it for something else. Okay. So we've converted that float. This is sort of an advanced thing, but just to save time for later, it asks you for the format. And what format does is there's a whole series of things you can type in here to make your string be formatted in a certain way. I don't know about you, but you can leave this blank if you like. I didn't like when I did this earlier, I didn't like my variable showing up with like about 6 or 7 different digits after the number. I didn't want 100.0000. I cared about 1 decimal point. So I changed it to look like this, just so it has 1 decimal point. So if you add that in, you'll get 1 decimal point. If you leave it blank, you're going to get a whole lot of decimal points. I just thought it looked a little kind of messy, really. Okay, so we've converted our float to a string. Now we need to basically, on this init state, we need to make this bit of the UI represent how much fuel we have, right? We need to show up correctly. I mean, we put 100 in there, but if our fuel is actually 50, we don't want to stay up to be 100, right? Okay, so we need to do this thing called set property, and we're going to be setting the property on this component right here. So you see this thing? It says text script. We want to change what's in there to what is the global variable for fuel. So to do that, to do a set property, I want you to get your mouse right over the text script and then left click and hold and drag all the way down to this particular state and then let go. And when you let go, this other little window will pop up, and we want set property. And so see how it says set property, and it even says fuel meter text. That's referring to this object's text script. And then there's all these different properties that we can change based on that. We can change all these if we wanted to, but really what we care about is text, and we care about the string. And so right now it says, okay, you're going to change this text component here to be whatever value. Now if we just typed in 100, that's exactly what would show up, but we want the variable. We want the thing that is, we've just converted from that float to a string. So these little bars here, you click on that to use a variable, drop it down, and we want that fuel string. All right, and that's it for the init state. That's going to on start take the fuel object, which is currently 0. We need to set that, and we'll do that later. It'll turn it into a string, and then it will then later apply that number to this particular text string. In fact, if we just press play, we can watch. It should take that fuel remaining and turn it into a 0. It did. 0.00. Excellent. Okay. So if that's working, it's time to move on to the update UI. And update UI is going to be really similar to what we just did on the init state, with just one exception. So to make things fast, you can manually enter these all again if you want to. I'm going to shift click on both of these, right click, hit copy selected actions. I'm going to come over here to update UI, and I'm going to right click and paste actions. Now I don't have to do that all over again. And then the only thing we need to add is an action called clamp float. And then another important thing to know is the order in which these things happen matter. So the first thing that's going to happen currently is that it's going to convert the float to a string, and then it's going to set the property, and then it's going to clamp the float. What is a clamp? A clamp is going to force a variable to stay within a certain range. I want that to happen first because I don't want any of this other stuff to happen before I've clamped. And the reason why I want that clamp to be there is I don't want the fuel meter to ever get below 0. It is totally possible, and it will happen if you don't use a float clamp, that you'll get just slightly below 0. Our rocket ship, at some point, you'll press the thrust key and it will be subtracting fuel, and it'll be a little bit off. The rounding will happen, and you'll be something like negative, 1 fuel, and that is impossible, right? Fuel is either it's either got fuel or it's empty. So we want to keep it from ever going below 0. So let's change the float value here. Let's do this to fuel, the global fuel we made. And then let's say the min is 0, and let's give the max value, let's just give it something high. So I can say 500, because we don't care about the high so much as we care about the min value. Now, order of operations matters, as I was saying. We want float clamp to be at the very, very top. You can drag this up. I like to right click though when it's several ones down and do move action to top. So now it will float clamp, it'll then convert to float, and then it'll set the property. And this will only happen when another script sends the update UI action. And that's it for fuel meter. Come back for the next tutorial and we'll do the next UI portion.